When a movie's given a PG-13, it means it's not suitable for children under the age of 13, or that parents should at least be cautious when showing it to their little ones. You might think that this would be a death sentence for a horror movie, as they would need a full R rating to really bring out the scares. This simply isn't true though, as there have been plenty of classics that have stuck firmly to these rules. Unfortunately, there have been some real stinkers too though. And with that being said, I'm Jem from WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 of the worst PG-13 horror films since 2010. Number 10. Insidious: The Last Key. When the first Insidious movie hit theatres in 2010, people were very impressed with this tale of otherworldly possession and were keen to see more. Alas, sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. The Insidious films just kept coming, with each subsequent sequel failing to reach the heights of the original. Things hit an all-time low with the fourth movie, 2018's The Last Key, which was actually a prequel to film number 1. Elise Rayner, the parapsychologist from the first movie, takes centre stage, leading an expedition to root out the ghosts living under their childhood home. Viewers were pleased to see veteran actor Lin Shaye in a main role, but that was about the only thing they were happy about. The Last Key was indicative of a franchise that had run out of steam. The plot was like 1,000 other haunted house stories before it, the characters were so paper thin you could see right through them, and the jump scares felt cheap and manipulative. That last part couldn't even be blamed on PG-13, as all the Insidious movies carry that rating. Number 9. Red Riding Hood. It's a formula that has been done time and time again. Take a well-established public domain story, add some darker edges, and sit back and let the money roll in. Well, that's what was attempted by 2011's Red Riding Hood, based on the fairy tale of the same name, but the only things that rolled in here were the bad reviews. Amanda Seyfried stars as Valerie, the red stand-in who lives in a village surrounded by a werewolf-infested forest. After attacks on the villagers start to increase, it's up to Valeria to discover the identity of the furry murderer before she ends up on the menu. Red Riding Hood was clearly trying to capitalize on the dark fantasy trend started by Twilight. It was even directed by Catherine Hardwicke, who made the first movie in that series. This wasn't enough to produce anything close to possible, as the film was torn to pieces like Red's grandma in the original story. The acting was bad, the plot was all over the place, and the ending was so confusing that nobody was sure how to feel. Seyfried was good at the very least, but this was a severe case of too little, too late. Number 8. Victor Frankenstein. With a recognisable name in the title and a cast including James McAvoy, Daniel Radcliffe, Charles Dance and Andrew Scott, it seemed highly unlikely that 2015's Victor Frankenstein would be a flop. Unlikely, but as it transpired, not impossible. The film acts as a prequel to the well-known story, as Assistant Iger, played by Radcliffe, tells the tale of how the once promising doctor, McAvoy, slowly transformed into a twisted monster. There was just one problem: it was really boring. In trying to make Victor into a suave anti-hero, all this movie did was expose how uninteresting he was without his most famous creation. Audiences were left waiting and waiting for something to happen, only to be greeted with a standard adventure plot that wasn't very scary and had little to do with the original mythology. A massive waste of a stellar cast and a tantalizing opportunity, Victor Frankenstein was left desperately waiting for lightning to strike, but the spark just never arrived. Number 7. The Vatican Tapes. 2015's The Vatican Tapes was Hollywood's latest effort to mine some more scares out of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Brune, played by Peter Anderson, is called upon to help a young woman named Angela, played by Olivia Taylor-Dudley, who has seemingly been possessed. This isn't your average run-of-the-mill demon though. The Cardinal discovers to his horror that Angela's body is harbouring none other than the spirit of the Antichrist itself. Even with such cataclysmic stakes and enough religious imagery to baptize a baby in, the Vatican Tapes under-delivered in every single way. It was full to the brim with every possession and exorcism cliche imaginable, to the point where you could pretty much predict everything that was going to happen after the first 15 minutes. What's more, it seemed to justify historical clerical abuse as a means of fighting the devil, which is all sorts of messed up. Viewers hoping for a fresh take on this subject matter got a classless reminder that there are far better movies out there to fill this particular need, ones that won't make you feel nearly as uncomfortable. Number 6. The Last Exorcism Part 2. 2010's The Last Exorcism delivered an intriguing tale about a disenchanted priest attempting to hang up his dog collar, but only after one last big score. It was tense, it was original, and it had deeper themes of religion running through it. And then came the sequel, 3 years later. The Last Exorcism Part 2, which is already a confusing title, instead centered on the possessed girl from the previous film, Nell. Upon realizing that her old demon has literally come back to haunt her, Nell female, played by Ashley Bell, must find a way to get rid of it all over again. While the first film was presented as a pseudo-documentary in found footage form, this one was just a normal film, which immediately costs it points. Then it actually started, and fans of the original outing were horrified to see that concept turned into a completely bog-standard psychological slog without any of the flair of what came before. Despite a great performance from Bell, the results were pretty poor across the board, and a planned third feature was eventually cancelled. Number 5. The Lazarus Effect. Those who know their biblical history will have probably figured out that 2015's The Lazarus Effect is about raising the dead. A secret university program creates a special drug that can bring people back from great beyond. However, there are side effects, which includes increasing aggression, which is not good for the poor souls working in the lab. There's nothing particularly original about this concept. Reanimator did pretty much the same thing in the 1980s, but there was still potential for a good story here, especially with the likes of Olivia Wilde, Evan Peters and Donald Glover on board. Sadly, it ended up being more like a biblical disaster than a miracle. The Lazarus Effect never got out of first gear, constantly retreading the same tired ground as every single resurrection story you've ever seen. The cast were fenced in by their utterly forgettable characters, and the slow pacing and lack of frights made it drag and drag and drag. The only nice thing to say about the Lazarus Pit is that it turned a good profit at the box office, but otherwise it deserves to be buried and left for dead. Number 4. Ouija. Ouija boards have always had a place in the horror genre, but in 2014, someone finally had the idea to make them the sole purpose of a movie. After an incident with one of the boards killing her best friend, Lane Morris, played by Olivia Cooke, decides to try and communicate with her by using an Ouija board. Lane is clearly not very bright. This results in her and her friends being haunted by the various spirits that inhabit the occult toy, as they each slowly succumb to possession, followed by a horrible demise. It's a formula that's been done many times over in horror, but very rarely as badly as this. Every single scare attempt in Ouija felt exactly the same. The room goes quiet, then a loud noise happens, rinse and repeat. This was not good enough for the majority of people watching, and considering the story boiled down to it's an Ouija board, there was little else to keep the viewers entertained. There is a happy ending to this story though, as a sequel, Ouija Origin of Evil, came out in 2016 and performed much better with critics. Number 3. House at the End of the Street. In the same year as her breakout role in The Hunger Games and her Oscar-nominated performance in Silver Linings Playbook, Jennifer Lawrence also appeared in a horror movie, and there's a reason you don't hear about that nearly as often as the other two. This was House at the End of the Street, in which J-Law plays a young girl who, along with her mother, moves to a new neighborhood that sits in the shadow of a house where a gruesome double murder was committed. It's the one at the end of the street, in case you hadn't already figured that out. There's more to this movie than meets the eye, as Lawrence's character learns that the facts of her past crime aren't as true as everyone believes. There was potential here for a fun, twisty-turny kind of mystery, but the movie got every single step completely wrong, leading to an end product that was bloated, messy, and hard to follow. Also, the house at the end of the street committed the ultimate horror movie sin. It wasn't scary. Never mind, Jenny. 2 out of 3 is not bad. Number 2. Spiders 3D. Good luck trying to track this 2011 film down, because it has more names than I give my dog. Sometimes called Spiders 3D, Spiders in 3D, or just Spiders. This movie starts with an old Soviet satellite falling to Earth. Its purpose was to perform experiments on a group of huge mutant arachnids, and when it crashes, the creepy crawlies are free to seek their revenge. When it comes to movies like this, filmmakers can go one of 2 ways. They can try and make it a genuinely frightening creature feature, or lean into the ridiculousness and go for that's so bad it's good kind of vibe. Spiders 3D does neither. Somehow, a movie featuring enormous bugs rampaging through New York subway manages to be sleep-inducing. The special effects aren't strong enough to be scary and aren't naff enough to be funny. The dialogue is earnest while also being pathetic, and none of the actors seem to know what the plan was, assuming there was actually one. Spiders 3D could have become a cult classic, but instead, it will be left to gather dust while the likes of Sharknado have all the fun. And number 1, Polaroid. Think of all the great horror movie weapons that have been used throughout history. Freddy Krueger's glove, Jason Voorhees' machete, Leatherface's chainsaw. Now get rid of all of those and replace them with an old camera. Doesn't quite have the same effect effect, does it? 2019 saw the release of Polaroid, which was based on a short film of a similar name and concept. After a teenage girl stumbles across a vintage Polaroid camera, she starts taking pictures with it, only to discover that anyone photographed goes on to die under horrible circumstances. Cameras aren't scary at all, but this movie makes absolutely no effort to try and change that. The attempted frights get nowhere near the heights they need to overcome a PG-13 rating, and the characters are so bland and underdeveloped that it's almost impossible to get invested in them properly. Polaroid was almost unanimously slammed for being one of the most boring horror movies in quite some time. Some even call it the worst horror movie of all time. And while it might not be that bad, it's certainly up there with the worst efforts of the 2010s.